Well, cleaning has happened. I'm ready to put this camera back together now. So as you can see, the body's pretty much ready to work with. So we'll start putting some stuff back in. And I'll start by putting the transfer shaft back in. This is the piece that carries the action from the cocking rack through to the shutter. That sort of tucks down behind the last fold of the bellows, so sometimes it's a bit awkward to get in place. That's where that goes. I'll just take a bit of molybdenum paste, run it on this guide post and fit the return spring in place. That's the return spring for the shutter release mechanism that is on the side of the struts. And the struts, well, I'll run a bit of molybdenum paste on there where this piece runs, and in the tube here that runs over the post in the body, I'll run some down there, and some synthetic grease into the slots at the back of the struts mechanism. I'm not putting any in the front because I'll only end up rubbing it off with my fingers while I'm working. And now to get this in position. That sits like that. Got to get that over that post. And I've got to put the bracket in that holds the shaft in place. The transfer shaft, the little bracket goes in there. I've got to get that seated in position. There's nothing holds it there until the struts and things are in place. Just got to get that in position and get the struts down past it, and if all goes well, that'll be held in position, and I can line up the hole in the tip from the top and put one of the 4 screws down there. The 4 black screws, one of them will probably have remains of glue on it from the base, so you can tell which one that is. The 2 prettiest ones you want in the film cassette chamber because people can see those. And that's about all we need to know. In fact, let's swap that one over because that's less than pretty. Right, well, that screw is holding the struts in place. It's also holding that little bracket which holds the shaft in place. Now, in the same relative position that that bracket is at the top of the camera, we need a spacer washer at the bottom of the camera. So I'll just slide that into position. And if I lift the struts away over the tip of my tweezers, that'll drop down into place. And if I've done it right, I'll be able to see the washer through the base of the camera here. And I can take the ugliest of my 4 screws, which I think I decided was that one. It's not picking up correctly. That's better. No, it's still not seated correctly. Oh, I don't know what's going on there. That screw's not going in straight, I think. The struts are pushing away instead of this thing screwing into the struts. It's catching on the edge of the body. That's better. So that screws in place. The one on the top's in place. And the two that go in the film cassette chamber, I can now put into position. And these will be the prettier examples. Pull those struts into position. Getting screws into a place like this is always hard. It's getting a black screw correctly seated in a place that's also black and in the shade. It's just a bit tricky. So I'll tighten the 4 screws up now. And that's the struts in position. So I can extend them all the way forward and put the focus mount on the front. Make sure these 2 arms are back out of the way. Now I did glue that felt light gasket back to the back of the front standard. When I'm doing these screws up, you'll notice I've got my finger hooked in underneath here, and that's because I'm taking the weight of the front standard on my finger, so that when I press down with my... Well, the camera just stopped recording there for magical reasons all of its own. I've just put those 4 screws in place. Each of the screws I put in, I supported the camera like this with my finger so that I was carrying the load and I wasn't pressing down on the struts, tending to collapse them, which would bend them of course, and that would give us bad results. Like it would mean that the lens standard would not be square with the camera body, with the film plane, or it might be compressed down so it was too close to the film plane, and so you'd end up with focus errors. And you may not be aware of that until sometime down the track. Okay, so that's all in place. If I collapse the front standard, I can put the 4 screws through that'll pass through the focus mount here and hold the bellows to the back of the front standard. So we've got 4 black screws. And these, because they're passing through the felt light gasket and the folded layers of leather on the front of the bellows, you're not pulling up 2 metal surfaces against each other, so the screws don't come to a sudden stop when you're screwing them in. You can keep going against greater and greater resistance. So if you're expecting the screws to suddenly stop moving in the traditional fashion, you'll be mistaken. If you keep doing them up, you'll end up snapping the screw. And they do snap off quite well, and then you've got to get the remains out of the back of the plate on the front of the bellows and replace the screw if you do that. Okay, so there our bellows are back in, connected up, and that part of the job is done. So now I need to assemble the inner and outer focus helical. I've got the focus helical here. It's I've been careful to get this aligned correctly so that my alignment marks that I'd scribed across there, 2 lines at the base, 1 at the top, are lined up correctly when the front faces of these are level. So I know that those 2 pieces are correctly aligned. Now I've got to lubricate that with some helical grease. I'll just back that most of the way out. Apply some helical grease in about 5 or 6 spots around the outside. You don't need an awful lot. If you overdo the grease, all you'll end up doing is having a focus ring that's unusually stiff. You're trying to lubricate it, not actually clog the entire thing up with grease. That's moving nicely. So I'll lubricate the outside here, where that's going to drop down into the mount. And the 2 spots where it runs on the inner helical runs on the guide posts. They're the 2 places that have the holes there visible at the front. And if I bring the camera back into the picture, making sure I've got my 2 alignment marks at the bottom, 1 at the top, so I know which way up this thing goes. Of course I ended up with an extra alignment mark at the top there just because I'd put it in the wrong place. That's alright. Check that the focus moves smoothly. That appears to be quite good. And here's the retaining ring. So I want to run a little bit of grease around here, and I'm using the helical grease because that's what I've got in my hand. But you could use just about any lubricant in that situation. That fits on there like that. And there are 6 small screws that hold the retaining ring in place. So I'll just run those down lightly. Once I've got them all in place, I can tighten them up. Right, with them all in position I can tighten them up. So again I'm supporting the front standard between finger and thumb, so I'm not compressing the struts. And I can tighten those 6 screws up. Check the action of my focus adjustment. That's nice and smooth. So that's all good. Focus scale ring can go in place. We've got our alignment marks top and bottom here, and you can usually also see where the screw heads bit in to the outer helical. So if there's any doubt, you can use them as a guide too. I'm just checking, I'm comparing the marks that I made, the marks the screw heads made, and making sure that I'm quite happy with the state of that and the position of that. There are 4 screws that hold this in position. They're the same size as the 4 screws. There's 6 screws that held the retainer plate in place. You want good examples in this position, because particularly if the focus scale ring, the edge of it's been damaged by having being pulled over the heads of the screws at some stage, typically after the grease had thickened up and gone hard and someone forced the focus movement. In those cases the edge of the band here could be damaged, and also the heads of the screws might be damaged, so you want the best possible screws there, and you can filch 4 from the retainer plate and damaged screws will work fine in the retainer plate. They've got nowhere to go. They're not so marvellous on a focus scale ring. Okay, so that's moving nice and smoothly, and I can put the front half of the shaft here through now. First off, we have this little bush. The shaft, I'll lubricate that on the inside with a bit of synthetic grease, on the outside with a bit of synthetic grease, and usually I'll just give it a little wipe on the front face for good measure. That needs to couple with our shaft. If you revolve it around a bit, you'll see that it does, and you can see as I turn the shaft at the front, you'll see this thing rotating at the back. That's in place. The cover for it goes here. 2 chrome plated brass screws, easily damaged. If you've damaged one, or if somebody else has damaged one, put the good one at the top. Put the damaged one down here where no one can see it. Just tighten those 2 screws up. Check that the focus scale ring still moves freely. There's a bit of slop in this and the positioning of it. If it's pushed too far in, you may find that it scuffs the focus scale ring. That's all good. Now the plate that goes on the inner helical with our rangefinder coupling needs to go on next. Here is the coupling. Slide that through there. You can see it runs through the top of the struts there, and we've got 2 tiny screws hold that in place. They are not the same size as the other screws. And at the top here, I'm going to position the arm so that the screw hole is visible there. And this shoulder screw goes in there. Check that it's free and moving freely in the middle of that slot. Not that you haven't got the screw jammed down on top of it. Okay, with that in position, I'll put a touch of grease in here. It's just synthetic grease. Just a bit forward and after that screw. That just means that that'll move freely. Now as the front of the camera collapses, you'll see that this disappears down that track. That's the purpose of having the hinge in that arm, is to allow that rangefinder coupling to disappear down to the back of the camera. Because if you didn't have a hinge in it, it would have to poke out the back of the camera when you collapsed the front. Okay, so that part's done. And now I can turn my attention to the film advance components. I'll start by putting the take-up spool back in the camera. So the bush goes into the spool in the round hole, not the slotted hole. And the bush goes to the bottom. So open the back of the camera, drop that into the take-up side of the body. We should be good to go. First I've got to lubricate the advance shaft here. And generally I've found that graphite grease has been the choice for this one, so I'll go and find some. So one of the advantages of this particular grease is it's quite tacky. It stays where it's put to a large extent. Once it's down between the bush and the shaft there, it's very good to go. I'm putting some onto the spring as well, and that's so that the coils of the spring will revolve over each other nice and smoothly. Now I'm just making sure that the tail of the spring is in the groove here in that bush. It's not. There we go, now it is. Otherwise you can't get that shaft to drop in properly. And should be able to put that in there. Now if it's seated correctly, this will sit nicely on there. Now I can tell that's not seated there correctly because I can't press my spool down, so it means that that spring is not seated in the slot properly. Now it is. Now by convention, the slot in this plate normally just points towards the ends of the camera. This one even have a slot. Let's have a look. Some of them don't. No, I can't see one. Okay. So we don't need to worry about that. So I'll get the screws in place. Fixing screws. 3 small nickel plated screws. They're not the same as any other screws on the camera, so you won't be mixing them up with anything. Right, with the 3 screws in place, I can now tighten them up. That's that in place. At the top of the camera, I need to assemble the clutch, get the clutch in here and get the top bush in place. So for the clutch, again I'm going to lubricate this with the graphite grease because it works well. So I'll take some graphite grease, put it into the outer part, the drum if you like. Now the spring, it's got a little tab on the top which must engage with this slot in the central piece. So this is a bit fiddly, but it's very possible to achieve it. So I'll normally just hang the spring on there, the tab engaged with the slot like that. Take a pair of crimp lug pliers, apply it to the top, hold that in place so that the tab is now held in place. If I revolve this with my fingers, it pulls that spring all into line, compressed, slide down that outer piece, and there's the clutch assembled. Now that'll move smoother in one direction than the other. That's quite normal, and it's the correct direction. Put some synthetic grease through there, drop that into place, drop it into place in the body. Now that engages with the slots in the top of the take-up spool. These 2 pinion sets here, I'm just applying a bit of grease to those, and I'll force that in like that, and the hydraulic pressure just pushes that in. I'll run a wipe through the centre. That pops on over the top here, and if I revolve that take-up spool with my thumb from the inside, it'll engage with the gear and allow this to drop down into position. This bush is held in place with 3 screws. As usual, get them all in position before you tighten them up. Check that that spool turns freely still. Tighten the 3 screws down tight, check that it still moves. That all looks good. Right. I think we can carry on at the base of the camera. Just hold that back out of the way. I'll just hang something through that leather so it's not disturbing us. That pair of tweezers will do nicely. Okay, so here, that's where we want our lever for the rewind button, the catch for the rewind button. And that has its own return spring and a shoulder screw. So the rounded tip of this piece here, I'll run some molybdenum paste over that. Usually I just wipe it through the pivot point at the same time because I've got it in my hand. That sits in there like that. Our return spring sits in there. That's not under any tension yet. We've got to hook that into place to tension it and get the shoulder screw in position. Now you've got to make sure that the screw passes through the lever and through the spring and isn't binding anything down tight like it is at the moment. Something's not right there. That's okay. Tighten that screw up, check that that lever moves freely. No, it's not as free as I'd like. I'm going to take that out. It may be that the lever's bent. It may be that that screw had been over tightened in the past and so that the screw bites into the body. Let me have a look at the screw. I'm looking at my rewind lever. It's not dead flat. So it's not as flat as it should be. I'll see if that'll flatten out. If it will, all well and good. Otherwise it'll have to be replaced. Now there's very little metal here across the edges of that hole. So these things, if they get distorted, I'm not even entirely sure how you go about making a mess of these, but people seem to achieve it. They must have a special technique. This is basically bent. I'll have a go at straightening that up and seeing if it'll move freely for us. I've got it in a pair of smooth jaw pliers here and I'm looking at it to get an impression of how much I've got to move it. If it moves really easily. There's so little metal here that gets damaged. Oh yeah. I'll have a go with that. No, it just doesn't revolve smoothly at all. Let's have a very close look at that. See what it looks like sitting on the screw. Perhaps the screw's damaged. Just holding it up to the light. It's like the shoulder's not deep enough. I'll try two things. I'm going to try a different screw and a different lever. See if I can figure this one out.